In this video I'm going to be building a bust of a character wearing a science fiction helmet. My previous project ended up being very involved and took a really long time to actually complete, so I wanted to do something a little bit simpler this time round. However, I didn't want to abandon my approach from the previous project, which was to try and combine sculpture and hard-edged modelling together. So for this project I figured I could sculpt up a organic creature, in this case a person, and then mould and cast that. I could then augment the sculpture by using hard-edged modelling involving found objects and cast pieces to create some additional costume pieces for the model. So as with most sculptures, I need to build myself an armature. What I'm going to use is this stuff, which is polystyrene, but it's actually polystyrene which is much denser than the usual stuff you find. I think this came from when I got a washing machine delivered, so I guess the packing foam in that needs to be quite strong. So I saved a bunch of this for projects and I found it to be really useful. I'm just drawing the basic shape of this on the foam, so I've got a rough shape to work with. And hot gluing all of this to a piece of copper pipe makes a nice secure armature. So I've put some monster clay in the microwave for a few minutes and I'm just building up a basic shape. Now for this piece I always intended to have the face mostly covered, but with the mouth visible. I've always found that sculptures which don't have eyes seem to be particularly eerie for some reason. I think it might be something to do with the Alien, from the Alien films. There's something about creatures without eyes that just makes them look particularly scary. So I've always been drawn to artwork of helmets and costumes where the eyes of the character aren't visible. So that does lead to the obvious question, why bother sculpting the entire face? And it's true, you probably won't see much of this, but I always think that there should be a degree of, I don't know what's the right word, fidelity to a sculpture, in that I like the idea that the viewer, if they were to sort of look down under the helmet, would be pleased to see that the face is actually there. Just adds an air of veracity to the sculpture, I think. So I always try to include as much detail as possible, even if it's areas that won't normally be seen. I'm reminded of the DVD extras for Lord of the Rings, where Bernard Hill, the actor who played Theoden, was talking about putting the costume on for the first time, and he noticed that the costume makers had actually included emblems and detail on the inside of the armour, something that would never be seen on screen. But I like the idea that the costume makers and the armourers had gone to the trouble of creating this as though it were a real piece of armour, rather than just a movie prop. So I quite like the idea of including that level of fidelity in everything I make. Now I don't always succeed, of course, but I like the idea of that as an aim. So at this stage I'm just blocking out the main forms of the face. Now of course I mentioned that most of the face will be hidden, so I do want to pay particular attention to the mouth and get something that's quite expressive. And because of that I decided to do a few individual studies of how the mouth could look ahead of doing this sculpture, just to practice getting these shapes down. I found it quite challenging to actually sculpt an open mouth. For some reason, I've seen people mention this for CG models as well, that the corners of the mouth are particularly difficult to get right, and I'm finding that a little bit as well with my sculpture. I actually found it quite difficult to persevere with this because the mouth just wasn't looking right for a long time, despite the practice that I put in ahead of time trying to get that right. But I often find with sculptures of faces that it's often you'll just add a little bit of clay here or adjust something there, and because you're working at a small scale, small changes can make quite a large difference. And so eventually this started getting in the area where it started to look real. There's a very sort of small I guess it's the uncanny valley where you're sort of on one side it just looks like a cartoon character, doesn't look real, then you'll just add a few little details here and there and suddenly it starts looking real. Now it took me quite a long time to actually get to that point, but once I got there I could feel the sculpture was starting to come together. Something that I find myself using quite a lot when I'm doing monster clay or Shavant sculptures is this, which is a wax melter. Now it's intended for putting scented wax in, and the wax melts and sort of adds a nice smell to the room. However, it's also quite useful for melting oil clays, so I use this to keep some molten monster clay or Shavant handy, so that I can add that onto the sculpture very easily. Now I often also have a blob of clay in my hand which I warm up just with body heat, and that's quite useful, but this stuff will get almost into a liquid state, so it's quite useful for just almost brushing onto your model to build up areas. It's not hot enough to actually burn you, so you can stick your finger in it, but I find this thing quite useful. One thing I do still struggle with is actually trying to get sculptures smooth. Now this is one reason why I do actually favour the hard edge modelling, because once I've made something in Bondo or in resin or something like that, I can then sand it down as much as I like to get it nice and smooth. Now of course you can't do that with a clay, and so that makes it slightly tricky, for me at least, to get the surface of the sculpture smooth. Now there are various methods which I do use, which include raking and smoothing out with flat sculpting tools, but despite doing all of those things I can never quite get it as smooth as I might like. As you can see here, I'm smoothing this down with some white spirit, and one thing I've also taken to doing quite frequently is to use a small blowtorch to actually melt the surface of the clay, and that is quite useful because it does get it quite smooth and shiny, as you can see. You've got to be a little bit careful because you can accidentally melt away some of the detail you've put in, so you need to do sort of quick passes with this rather than just holding it on the sculpture for a couple of seconds at a time. But despite all those methods, I still haven't got this quite as smooth as I might like. So what I'm going to do is cast this up in resin, and then I can actually sand it down further to get it nice and smooth. So there's my finished sculpture, and as you can see I've got an open mouth for this one. So my intention for this is to actually make a mould but cast it up in roto casting resin. So all that means is you pour a small amount of resin into the mould and then rotate the mould around. The resin sticks to the outside and cures, and that gives you a hollow cast. So what I'm going to do here is actually cut the back of the head open once I've got my roto cast copy, and then I can cut the back of the mouth away and actually put some teeth inside the head, just to give the head a bit of dimensionality and a little bit more detail. So I'm going to make a jacket mould for this. What that means is I'm going to pour silicone over the sculpture and then keep reintroducing it as it drips down until it cures, which will give me a nice jacket around the mould. What I'm then going to do is create a hard case around it with fiberglass to hold that jacket in place. So in order to make that work, I need a platform that can catch the silicone as it drips down the model. So I'm just putting a cardboard surround in place at the bottom so the silicone can't drip all over the work surface. So there we go. Now the silicone will drip down the sculpture and should catch most of the details, but because I've got some particularly indented detail around the nose and mouth, I'm going to use some air from my airbrush just to blow the silicone into the details and make sure it picks up all of the detail that I need. What you don't want is for the silicone to dry and there to be a cavity inside the mouth filled with air, so you've got to be particularly careful if you've got sort of undercuts like this to make sure the silicone gets in to all of the areas that it needs to. Once you've picked up all the detail, it's really just a case of continually reintroducing the silicone from the bottom of the mould to the top. The flow of the silicone will slow down as it cures. Once you've got one layer of silicon on there which is cured, you can then come in with a thicker layer of silicon, and many silicon systems use something called a thixotropic agent, which allows you to add a thickening agent to the silicon so that instead of flowing you can just sort of brush it on like a putty. So that's what I'm doing here. So my silicon has now dried, and what I need to do now is to create a hard case around the mould to hold it all in place. So what I've done is to create a divider using some cardboard here, and I'm just brushing on some polyester resin and some glass fibre mats to create a hard case. So the hard case is now dried, and I'm just splitting it open with a chisel. In order to get the sculpture out, I'm just going to cut the mould at the back. The majority of this is going to be covered with costume anyway, so it doesn't matter too much if there's a mould line where I cut it. Sorry for the bit of hair hanging in front of the camera there. So there's my mould, and I can now mix up some rotocasting resin, pour that in, and start rotating the mould as it dries. So that's gone from flowing quite freely around the inside of the mould to quite a thick gel-like paste, and I'm just using my finger here to spread that evenly over the surface to make sure there aren't any sections which are too thin. As you can see, there's a section of the mould inside the mouth of the cast, and that's what creates the hollow area that I need. So I'm just being particularly careful when I pull the mould away from the cast here to make sure that it doesn't tear. I did 2 batches of resin for this one, and that seems to have come out okay. It's picked up all the details that I need, so that looks pretty good. Now this piece is just a test one. I figured I'd do one for actually building the helmet on, and then once I've finished the helmet I'll do a new cast from the mould, and that'll be my master for painting. So in order to build my helmet, I'm turning to my trusty clear plastic spheres. In this case it's actually an egg-shaped version that I'm going to use. And these are cool because they give you some really cool geometric shapes to work with. They're also very easy to cut and shape. So I'm just cutting that down to the size of the Dremel. And what I've also done is to cut some other shapes apart here, so I can start building up the back of the helmet as well. Now it's not going to be transparent in the final version, but it does make me think that maybe I should make a sculpture which is actually wearing a clear visor in a helmet, so that might be an idea for a future project. Now for these side pieces, what these are actually from a mould of a yogurt pot that I made for one of my earlier mech projects. All I did was to pour about 1.5 centimetres of resin in, so I've really just cast the bottom of the yogurt pot. But as you can see, it's got quite a nice machined looking shape to it, so I think that'll work quite well for the sides of the helmet. So what I'm doing is to just glue in some strips of styrene plastic on the inside to hold all this stuff together. I also want to have some sort of, not exactly organic, but interesting geometric shapes on this. So I've just taken some super sculpting and I'm just trying to sculpt out a rough form of how this could look. I'm thinking this might be some form of air vent system perhaps in the helmet, something like that. Okay, I don't mind that as a general shape. So what I've now done is to make a template in paper, and I'm going to cut that out in styrene plastic. What I'm doing here is slowly building up the form using styrene plastic. So I've got the basic shape. What I now need to do is give it some dimensionality. So what I'm doing is cutting out these small shapes and gluing them on. Once I glue the top edges together, that will actually hold the curve of the styrene plastic in shape. So now that I've glued those on, that's actually quite a rigid shape. So I'm now coming in with some additional styrene plastic to add the top layer. So there we go. So now that I have my framework, what I can now do is come in and actually start filling in that framework with Bondo. Once I've got the Bondo in there, that will make it nice and rigid, and I can then start sanding it down and adding some additional mechanical details. And there's still a little bit of flex to the framework, so what I've done is to tape it in place, and I'm just putting some Bondo on the inside. This first layer is really just to add some structural strength to it. So once that's dry, this thing should be very, very rigid, and I can then come in and add the additional layers of Bondo to build this up into a solid geometric shape. For the back of the helmet, I'm also coming in and filling in the gaps between all the bits of styrene plastic and cast resin pieces that I've got. Once they're all filled in, I can then start sanding and sand this down to a smooth geometric shape. So that's as far as we've got so far. As you can see, I've got some sort of canister shapes on the top, and what these are moulds of some NO2 canisters which I made a while back. I just cut those down to size and glued them on. So that's as far as I've got so far. I still need to build up some additional mechanical detailing on this and also add a suit to the bust of the character as well. So I'll be building that up with some additional found objects and cast resin pieces. So there'll be a part 2 of this, and I'll also look at painting up the character. I'm actually thinking the armour might look quite nice in a bright orange, which maybe sounds a bit odd, but I think I can make it work. So that's the plan, but for the meantime, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.